Coaches Take on Work is a community of coaches sharing our perspectives on work today. Come for the spicy takes and stay for the quick tools and tips. Find everything from best practices in management and leadership to our thoughts on trending topics in work and some fun things you may not be expecting.
Jaclyn, I like your background.
2 years after working remotely, finally get around to making a background. So here we go. Real life.
It looks like a plastered on background, so well done.
Was inspired. I was inspired by Chelsea, honestly. I'm always inspired by that Murphy bed turd, beautiful backdrop. Always. Years. For what? For 3 years? 4 years? I don't know.
Oh my goodness. Yeah,
2
I
years.
don't know. Thank you.
So, shall we get started with our actual topic, since Jaclyn does have the hard stop at 9?
Yes, let's do it.
All right. So, today we're talking about what it means to listen well and tools you can use to become a better listener. So, the 3 tools or frameworks we'll talk about today are levels of listening, and then active listening and strategic questions. And these are all tools that Jaclyn and Chelsea and I have used with our clients quite a lot, as listening is one of those topics that does tend to come up quite a lot. So, about me, before we dive into all of that, my name is Anna Lahti, and I'm a certified leadership coach and founder of Talent Squared, and I focus on coaching leaders and managers at all levels of the organization to flourish and ultimately exponentiate their talent and the talent around them. And today we have with us Jaclyn Cook and Chelsea Seid, and they will be talking us through this topic. But Jaclyn, how about you introduce yourself before we actually dive into talking about levels of listening?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I'm Jaclyn Cook, founder of Jaclyn Cook Coaching, and I'm a certified coach that focuses on the cross-section of leadership, productivity, and also personal finance, really using the power of coaching to help professionals at all levels really gain confidence and impact at work, in and out of work, truly. So excited to talk through this. I think that listening is a subtle, sneaky skill that we can really continue to grow in, but that can be really powerful when done well.
I think this is one of Chelsea's favorite topics as well. So Chelsea, please introduce yourself.
Yes, it is. I am Chelsea Seid. I am the founder, chief coach, and consultant at Talent Praxis, where we help companies and leaders turn their ideas into practices to achieve their goals. And listening in general is one of my favorite topics because it ties so much into miscommunication, which is sort of my overarching favorite theme, just the idea that we're all out there in the world talking and listening and no one's always really understanding each other. So where can we constantly play that game, trying to bridge the gap between what was said, what was intended, what you heard? So I think of it like a little investigation and find it very fun.
That's absolutely true. So what does it actually mean? What does it look like when we are listening well?
So when we are listening well, really, we're listening for, I kind of just listed, but to say in a little bit more detail, we're listening for what was said. So what were the actual words that are coming out of your mouth? You're listening for what was intended, and you're listening for what you heard as well. So you're really looking for, where is that gap? Where are my biases, assumptions, my context, my frameworks changing or translating what was being said from the person I'm speaking to? And for this conversation, we'll be speaking about English speakers because we are talking in English. But I will say, when I'm saying translating, I'm meaning English to English. I'm meaning Anna or Jaclyn says something to me, and in my head, I'm translating it based on my own knowledge, understanding context, frameworks, etc. And that translation is causing the message to get disrupted. So if I'm listening well, I'm listening for that disruption, and I'm listening to try to better understand my audience who's speaking to me, and not just the bias floating around in my head.
So you kind of already answered the question of why is it important to listen well as well. So that's great. That was a great introduction to this topic. And continuing on that idea, the ways in which we listen can be quite different depending on the person, the context, what is going on. I found that the levels of listening model is very helpful when trying to explain that listening is more than just hearing words that someone is saying, and actually trying to explain to someone what the different ways to listen are, and then try to come to a kind of conclusion of, well, what does that mean for your listening, and how could you actually begin to listen differently, not necessarily better, but differently. Chelsea, do you want, either one of you, but maybe Chelsea, do you want to talk us through the levels of listening? We did a little bit of almost like a podcast episode, but we did a webinar with people from my team at my company earlier this summer, and Chelsea helped me talk through levels of listening then, and that went quite excellently. I actually had some quite good feedback on that. So
good.
Yeah,
Good.
Chelsea, tell us a little bit about the levels of listening.
Well, and Jaclyn can fill in where I'm missing, I'm sure. So it's going to sound similar to what I just shared, but I really encourage people, especially if listening is something you're actively practicing or trying to get better at, download the levels of listening, just like have them up in a sticky note on your screen when you're working, and actually think of it. I mean, kind of gamify this. At what level are you listening when you're talking to people? So think about it in that context is my recommendation. So the first level is downloading. So this is just listening from habit. This is kind of why I said listening well is important, right? Because if I'm listening from my habits, from my context, from my biases, from my contextual frame of mind, I'm really translating your message at all times. So you're saying something, I'm translating it based on my knowledge and what I understand, and I've listened. This is habitually what we're doing every day. Second level of listening, which is, I think, a level that a lot of people try to explore, is factual. So this is listening outside of your bias and assumptions, outside of your mind, and listening for the objective facts. And so this would get down to what was said, not what did you assume their tone to be? What did you assume based on their body language? What did you assume based on prior context you know about this situation? Just factually, what was said? What were the words that came out of their mouth? What were the facts? And so, especially if you're working with a coach, you can have a nice back and forth on what you think was said in this situation. And anyone who's ever studied crime or law or seen Law and Order has an idea that the facts are hard to remember appropriately, right? Then we get into the third level of listening. This is where I would actually challenge that I don't think most people do as commonly, or at least aren't as thoughtful or perceptive of it, which is empathetic listening. So this is listening truly to understand the perspective of the other person, to consider it in their shoes, to consider, what is in their mind. So whatever biases and contexts and perceptions you have going into a conversation, they have them as well. So really trying to think about their perspective, their side of things. And when I practice or do this with someone, again, this is an exercise I highly recommend doing with a coach, a friend, a partner, anyone who can challenge you to get out of your head and think from their perspective. But when doing this with someone, trying to be thoughtful and catch yourself when you start to slide back into your own subjective opinion. Well, they probably think this, but listen, here's the deal. Well, they probably think this, but listen, I mean, anything where you just add a but or start to slide into your own assumption, can you just drop that for a moment? What are all the different perceptions, thoughts, motivators, needs they may be bringing into that conversation? And then the last level that actually Anna helps me understand how to communicate, because we discuss this one a lot, is generative. And it's when anything becomes possible. So it can be a bit hard to grasp, but the way we finally landed on explaining it that I think is just most clear is the idea that you're dropping your perceptions, beliefs, context, and understanding. The other person is also dropping theirs, and you're willing to come to a truly generative, explorative conversation around what is being said. I'm willing to think of any possibility. So if you're into negotiation, this is expanding the pie. If you're a brainstormer or an innovator, this is when brainstorming truly happens at its finest, when I'm able to drop my beliefs, drop my perception, understand where my team member is coming from, and truly look for that new possible outcome that we would have never come to alone from what that individual is sharing. So those are the 4 levels, and I hope highly recommend gamify it. Give yourself a little, what level was I listening? How was I doing? Challenge.
I think that's a good way of getting started with applying that. And generally, like, it sounds like the underlying theme for each of their levels is this idea of really like grounding and identifying where you are adding color and context, where actually there's gaps and you don't know what's going on. But because we are humans and the way we are, we do tend to try to fill in those gaps just to make things easier for ourselves and move on more quickly and gather information more quickly. So really often it sounds like often it's about slowing down and becoming more conscious of what you're actually doing. I like this sticky notes idea. Jaclyn, are there any other ideas from your side of how you've seen this or recommended this to be put into practice?
The one other line that I've used in coaching, and I actually think I heard it from one of my clients at some point, was what's the story versus the fact, or story versus the reality? And so just to add to the factual piece of the 4 levels, just that idea of we do fill in the gap, like you're saying, Anna. And I just liked, it seems like it really hits home for people when I just say, story are you creating, right? We paint these narratives. And so taking that away and then actually, as Chelsea said, really what is just the facts. It's just a helpful way to slow down and not make it charged, right? Sometimes these things, like you're saying, are charged or assumptions or it's implications. And so just asking, what was the story that I'm making up versus what were the facts? I'd like that one too.
That's from Crucial Conversations. So we'll link it in the call notes or the meeting notes. But also a challenge I've seen from Crucial Conversations, they like the context of story and facts, that it's hard to separate. So if it's easier for you to remember what's the story and the facts, remember that. But then if you're wondering how to differentiate, listen at all 4 levels. So I love that. Thanks for bringing that up, Jaclyn.
That's actually a really good point, because oftentimes when we talk about being good at communicating and being good at presenting is to be a good storyteller. We're often encouraged to tell a story. So it would feel natural also that when we're listening, we're trying to identify that story, identify that nice storyline, that arc, so that we can remember more accurately, and that we find things that resonate with us. But that's both a good thing and a bad thing. Helps us remember, but then again, maybe causes us to make a little bit more assumptions than we would if we were just listening for the facts. Good things to note. So we've talked about the process of listening. Now let's talk about active listening, which is the next tool we really want to cover today. So Jaclyn, what does it mean to you to practice active listening?
Yeah. And I want to go back to this idea too. So we're really talking about practice, right? And I think all of our podcasts say this, but it is a skill. And this is just one more tool you can use to actually practice this and test this. And so active listening is one of those. And it starts with what Anna kind of highlighted, like grounding and presence is a word I'd actually use there, is take a minute first to see where you're coming in from, right? So it's almost that idea of putting aside your story or your assumptions at the door. So starting with presence, and then actually taking a moment to think about the speaker, really coming from their lens, which again, as you can probably see, these are connected to some of those levels, right? So then it's really just, what am I hearing? What are they actually saying? Seeking to understand is a term that I would like to think there instead of seeking to be understood, right? We hear that, but when we are listening, it's actually just so that I can understand what the person's saying, which oftentimes, especially in business, we're going fast. We made a joke when we started this call, I have a hard stop. Like we are going from thing to thing to thing. So to slow down, actually just seek to understand, it might even take some more time. So really just creating space for that, and not as much as we can putting the extra judgments on or anything like that, but just to listen, to hear what they're saying and to understand what they're saying. And then practicing awareness. Again, this takes time and practice, but the idea of like, what is the greater content and context happening? So what is the content? Like, what are they actually saying? Which goes back to kind of the facts. And then the feelings behind it, which was the other level, right? Like, and then what are they feeling about that? What am I feeling about that? there's also an element of like, what is that bringing up for me? So active listening can even be like, I'm sensing this, and how does that relate to what's coming up? Or I'm noticing, and we'll get into not putting judgment on it, but like really saying like, hey, I'm noticing, how would I say it? That there's a lot on your plate from what you share. Like, what is that bringing up for you? How are you feeling about that? So just really taking space and time to be present, to reserve judgment and seek to understand, and then to really practice the awareness around what is the context and how one is feeling about it. Did I miss anything, Chelsea?
I don't think so. I'm just loving, I don't think I've heard seeking to understand versus seeking to be understood. So I'm still stuck on that point. I'm like, brilliance, Jaclyn, striking brilliance. So I didn't listen to everything you said. I liked that so much I got stuck there.
And that happens, right? That's a good example where I think this happens a lot in like big team meetings. And there's a whole, anyways, I won't get into like parts that are outside my spectrum of knowledge, but like neurodiversity also impacts this too, I think. And so we do have a lot of information coming at us. Chelsea liked that line, so she stopped listening, and that's not bad. She enjoyed something, but this happens all the time. And so when we say practicing active listening is hard and takes a lot of practice, we mean it, because there is so much happening around us, let alone, I think we're gonna say it somewhere else, but I'm just gonna say it now, also removing distractions, right? Like that is like the number one. I know this is talked about in a million different contexts, but just distractions themselves, people having their Slacks up and in like inboxes up while they're in meetings. Stop that. Distractions are going to just set you back before you even begin with any active listening. So that's my other tip.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you did mention repeating back as well earlier, which is, I think, something we've all recommended to managers as we've been coaching them, especially when you're talking about, well, how do you have an effective one-on-one discussion, for example. I think repeating back is something that we've probably advised on multiple occasions to do, to help you ground, be aware, and stay present in that moment. And with the distractions, I think there as well, really drawing awareness to what is distracting you. I think we've advised as well in some of the articles we've written, things we've talked about before, to help managers like create the space before they go into a meeting to think about what's going on, to ground, and to figure out, are there any specific things that my mind is stuck on right now that might distract me in this meeting I'm going into, and find those methods of either, getting rid of that. So either writing it down or closing that email, or asking for a little bit of extra time just so you can finish up that email and send it, so you don't need to think about it during that meeting. But finding those ways of minimizing those distractions. And I want to remember also that I have at least recommended to some of the people I've coached to, when you are listening, even if you're not repeating back verbally, that you're at least doing it in your head, that you're actively summarizing in your head, so that you're forcing yourself to concentrate. Because I at least have a really bad habit of getting distracted quite easily when I am in a conversation with someone. So then forcing myself to summarize in my head, constantly be summarizing what they're saying so that I can repeat it back to them, has helped me quite a lot. So those are things that I've found really helpful. Chelsea, can you think of any examples of situations when you've coached someone on specifically on active listening and becoming a better active listener that you could potentially share with us? I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit there, but you tend to remember good examples from your coaching interactions.
I have examples of this. I was not the coach. So I have done this both in therapy and being coached in teams, and therapy in teams, and in therapy in relationships. And so I highly recommend to practice active listening as an example, to sit down one-on-one with someone, ask them a question, any question you want, let them share their answer, and then your job is to parrot back what you heard. And so the very first thing I would do if you're hearing this, is start practicing that. Find a buddy, honestly, a spouse or a best friend, sometimes the best person, because you're probably not actively listening to them either. And so start practicing that exercise. That's where I said I've done this in couples therapy. I'm not speaking as a hypocrite. I'm speaking as a participant. And then practice sharing what they said. So as Anna mentioned, then as you feel more accomplished than this, or if you're in environments where you feel less safe to practice, you can do that in your head, right? You can do the summary in your head, but start with saying it out loud. And you're looking for what facts you can recall. So as an example of what we just did, and this is a podcast, this is not a conversation, but if this was a conversation with Jaclyn and I was practicing active listening, I should recognize I've stopped listening. And normally what I would do at that point is politely interrupt. And she's like, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm stuck on what you just shared. I love that. I've never heard that before. Could you elaborate, or could we talk about that for a minute? Right? Because as an active listener, it doesn't mean I'm memorizing every word coming out of your mouth. It means I'm actively aware of when I'm listening to every word coming out of your mouth and when I'm not, right? I'm actively aware of where I am as a listener in the discussion and how well I'm listening. And the last sort of example I would give here that I hear most often when I'm coaching is, oh yes, actively listening. Of course, I actively listen. And my response is always, and this is if you've ever worked with me, how? What do you do? If you cannot give me any active behaviors, proactive behaviors that you're doing to listen actively, you're not listening actively, because active is an action word, meaning you're doing something. So if you're listening actively, there is something you are doing. Anna shared, she summarizes in her head. I shared, when I recognize that I've stopped hearing the words you're saying, I interrupt you. People parrot back, right? Another example we'll give is at the end, Jaclyn gave this example. Sounds like you have a lot on your plate, right? So you don't have to parrot back word for word. I recommend you start there because it's really interesting to see how well you do. And then you get to parroting back the summary. Can I capture the summary of what you shared and say it back to you for confirmation that I heard you accurately before moving on to another point, before moving on to the ideas in my brain? The last piece I would give is capturing back emotion, especially if they used the emotion word. I'm just really upset lately. Sorry to hear you're upset. Do you want to talk more about that? Right? Let's pause on that. So you could do anything as long as you are taking an action, you are doing a verb in your listening. So if you're actively listening, tell me how, and I will believe you. If you say, I do it naturally, I do it innately. No. We went over this in levels of listening. You're no longer actively listening. You're listening from habit, which is fine. Some people who are habitually more empathetic than others, you're still not actively listening, right? It's in the word itself. So that would be the two things. Practice one-on-one with a pair who you feel trust with and you feel safety with, and you're willing to fail because you're going to the first several times you do it. And then the second piece is just, can you actually share the verbs, the actions, the behaviors that you are aware of consciously, front of mind in a moment when you're actively listening?
I might
I love
add
how
here.
you talked about, oh, sorry. I love how
I was going to add.
loved how Chelsea said about being like actively aware and actively participating in that discussion in that way.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that that doesn't get lost, is that this is not just, we think of listening as passive in and of itself, like the style in which I am taking in information. And then when I'm speaking, I'm the one that's giving information, but we've hopefully blown that out of the water. But I think what Chelsea just said there really punctuate that the conversation might even flow differently. It might feel differently. You might pause, kindly interrupt at a place where it's worth pausing because you are leaning in. And so it's definitely worth practicing in a safe space. If you really want to refine the skill, I think that's a great call out, but just, it's active. It's going to feel different. It's going to feel better. Like, I think people, when you actually practice active listening, it's more of an engaging conversation for everyone. Like, you actually, I think some of us as coaches, probably that's what we love, is like, we're active listening the whole time. And it's kind of like a little investigation. Like, it's great. It's so much more fun. So challenge hopefully is on for everyone.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, that you do get so much more out of that conversation when you're actually concentrating on it. You walk away feeling like you actually engaged, you learned whatever it was that happened in that conversation. The one thing I think we didn't mention was mirroring, but that's actually a really important part of that idea of actively participating in the discussion, is that you are mirroring back the tone, the emotions, the way in which someone is saying you are. It's kind of, well, it's part of the parroting back as well, that you're using the same kind of words, language, context as they are using, to step into that world of theirs and try to be as empathetic as possible to experience what they are experiencing when they're telling you about that whatever they're telling you about or talking to you about. We've talked a lot now about active listening, and we've given a lot of, or Chelsea gave some tips on how to get started with active listening, and Jaclyn so nicely summarized why it's important, why it's ever so important to active listen. The last tool we wanted to talk about today was the idea of asking strategic questions, really to supercharge that conversation and engage your speaker even more, so they give you more content to listen to. Essentially, questions really do have that power to bring forth even more of that good content that can help you hear what is actually going on. Jaclyn, what do we mean when we say strategic questions?
Yeah, I think you started highlighting it. It really is being thoughtful about the questions we ask, and that those actually will drive the impact of the conversation. I think we've kind of been saying that this whole time in that way. And the type of question, and I think we'll get into exactly like some examples of this, but it really will impact the response. So, and it's amazing. And that's kind of maybe what I call out when I say as coaches, we are practicing strategic questions. Hopefully, if you're with any coach, it's like 101, because it does drive a more expansive conversation. You get more out of it. You learn more. You understand more. They understand sometimes even more about themselves or what is going on for them. And so it can really add awareness, understanding, which is kind of the root of a lot of this, and hopefully greater impact between whatever topic is being discussed at that point.
Yeah. Maybe each of you could give some examples of what strategic questions might sound like or look like.
Sure. I'll do my favorite ones. I have two favorites at the top of my list right now. They evolve. The first is the removing barriers type question. And so whenever someone is stuck, well, I need to know this first, or I'm missing this information, or this is a blocker. Pretend as if that's gone. What if there were no blockers? What if there were no hurdles? What if you knew this could work out perfectly? What would become possible then is definitely one of my favorites. And then the other one, which sounds so simple, but is just asking about importance and value. What's important about this? What's valuable about this for you? And starting to understand the motivators behind why the person is bringing this up. So I think the first gets you to like a generative space in listening, which is pretty big jump up. So maybe don't start there. And the second gets you to an empathetic space. I want to know why the person is bringing this up, why this is valuable to them, what their motivators are in this conversation. And so, both are pretty high in the levels of listening. You could start lower, but those are a couple of my favorites right now.
I'll go maybe a little lower.
Those are good ones.
And I would say, I mean, you heard it in Chelsea's response. She said what both times. So that, I mean, again, this might be, maybe this is almost too amateur, but really thinking about open question versus closed question. Maybe I'm getting into something else we're going to talk about, but what, how versus a closed-ended question. So what is the timeline versus will it be done by tomorrow? Right now, it's just like yes or no, or there's no expansive conversation there. What is the timeline? What do you need? How is your workload going? Right, just creating space. So what and hows are king or great, and so
Queen.
Queen. Definitely explore open question with a what or a how, and I'll add a caveat. Whys can sometimes feel almost attacking too. So when we're trying to think of examples of, why did you do this? Could be a little bit charged. So it's like, what contributed to that decision? How did we get to this place? So live in what and hows as a place for, I think, the lower levels of active listening, and it'll be easier to try as well.
I think creating space is the key. There is, you said creating space, and I really love that, because that is really the idea behind asking open-ended questions, is to create the opportunity to hear another perspective and not to have those assumptions clouding the response you are going to get there. So that really is, I think, the key, and asking those kind of, well, why, how questions, what happened, like what made you get to this conclusion, rather than the question that is closed and has a judgment to it, or almost. And like just Jaclyn said, we can start with questions that are easier, like changing what is your timeline to, do you have a timeline for this, or what is your plan to, do you want to go with plan A or plan B? And then we can move on to the much broader questions when we maybe have practiced the open-ended questions a little bit. But the goal is obviously to get towards that space of being able to ask, well, if there were no barriers, if there were no blockers, what would be possible then? What do you see as the opportunities? But I think a lot of managers, especially newer managers, may feel a little bit intimidated by a question like that. So that
I started pretty high level. Start with Jaclyn's questions.
Aspirational.
And I think it depends so much on who you are. So I think any way you can ask a question and leave it more open-ended is a great start. We are coming up on time, so from both of you, maybe starting with Chelsea, how would you wrap up our conversation? What is the takeaway you want to leave our listeners with here?
Primary takeaway, I know I've harped on this, but I'll do it again. If you consider yourself to be a great or an excellent listener, wonderful. What do you do when you're listening? What does that look like? What are the results? How is that effective? If you're unsure, if you are, same thing. What do you do when you're listening? What does that actually look like? What are the results? How is it effective? And then for either of those, pick just one of the million tools we shared today and consider practicing it and see how it goes. How does it change your results? And listen, with either of these, if the results are what you want, don't break something it's not broken, right? But if you recognize I'm not quite getting what I want out of communication or conversations, try one of these, see how it shifts things. None of these are going to solve everything, but they're definitely going to shift your outcome for better or for worse. And then you can start to observe if you like that shift. How did it work? Maybe I want to practice one additional thing they shared. So I like just start there. And the extra, sorry, I'll do one more piece I would add. If you are asking more open-ended or explorative questions with people, or even if you're just holding space for a deeper listening conversation, do not expect your audience is on the same page as you. Do not expect they've also listened to this podcast and they're fully bought into these concepts or ideas. They may think that, you started to be on a strange page, right? Like they may be very confused with your new actions and reactions to them. So perhaps share that it's something you're actively practicing, or just give space for them to respond however they want, and that is okay. If you ask someone the questions I pose and their response is, I don't know, that's fine, right? I often find in coaching, half the responses I get are, I don't know. And if I sit in silence long enough, they end up knowing. So give the other person space to also be human, also be learning, also be growing, also be practicing, and potentially unaware of whatever weird thing you're trying differently. So that's my addition.
That was excellent. Thank you for reminding us of that very important point.
That is a really great point. And I think my takeaway really would be going back to the idea of practice. I think Chelsea said this, but find a safe space. It really is a skill, like any other skill where you need to have reps at it. So find someone where it could be really weird, or it's not weird and awkward to literally pare it back or to mirror or do these things explicitly. We know the business world is a whole nother element. And so, yeah, practice with a friend, practice with a spouse. Don't let the fear of getting it wrong stop you from trying, because it really can be so powerful once you start to get familiar and recognize that you are going to be breaking down natural habits, the way you responded, the way you've shown up for years. So be patient with yourself, but it's absolutely worth the practice.
Well, that's a really good point as well, to give yourself the space to practice and to fail and then try again and to observe the results and see how things are changing for the better. Thank you both. I think this was a very, very enlightening conversation, and we covered a lot today. So hopefully we didn't overwhelm anyone. And Chelsea, you mentioned that one book. Which one was it? The
Crucial Conversations. I'll link it.
Yes, Crucial Conversations, that she will link in the show notes, and we can also link to some other materials on these tools in case anyone wants to take a deeper dive into them. But thank you, Jaclyn and Chelsea.
Thanks for organizing,
you.
Anna. See y'all soon.
Bye.
See you.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Coaches Take on Work through your favorite streaming service so you don't miss a future episode. We are Coaches Take on Work. And for this episode's hot take, I often find in coaching, half the responses I get are I don't know. And if I sit in silence long enough, they end up knowing. So give the other person space to also be human, also be learning, also be growing, also be practicing, and potentially unaware of whatever weird thing you're trying differently.